Most people start their week with coffee, maybe a mild inconvenience, maybe a bill they don't want to open. I started mine with a letter that would flip an entire community upside down, though I didn't realize it at first. The envelope looked official, the sort of thing you assume is a mistake or an advertisement designed to look important. But the seal was real, the weight of the paper was real, and the name printed across the front, mine, made my pulse tick up just a bit. Inside was a formal notice informing me that a relative I barely remembered had passed away and left me something. Not a sentimental trinket, not a dusty piece of furniture, but 1,000 acres of land. And not just any land, not tucked away woodland, not farmland waiting to be sold off. No, this 1,000 acres happened to include, right in the center of it, a neatly manicured, self-important little suburban development run by one of the most notoriously strict HOAs in the entire county. At first, the sheer scale felt absurd. People like me didn't just inherit land they'd never stepped foot on, much less land actively occupied by families, retirees, and a battalion of clipboard-wielding HOA enforcers. I reread the paperwork twice just to make sure it wasn't some legal riddle or elaborate prank. But it was real. Every plot, every cul-de-sac, every walking path residents assumed belonged to their HOA sat squarely on land that now belonged entirely to me. And the cherry on top? The HOA didn't own a single square foot beneath their roads, their amenities, or even their own office building. They leased the land on a decades-old contract originally signed by my late relative. A contract so outdated, so poorly maintained that the HOA board had probably forgotten it existed. I quickly realized they were living in a fantasy where they believed they ran the place, dictating every blade of grass and porch decoration, never suspecting that all their rules were written on land that wasn't theirs to control in the first place. I wasn't sure what to do with this information at first. My life up to now had been simple, quiet, predictable. Nothing prepared me for owning a small empire overnight, let alone one filled with people who had no idea their entire neighborhood sat on borrowed ground. I tried to wrap my mind around the old family map attached in the documents. 1,000 acres was bigger than entire towns. It stretched across forests, fields, ponds, wrapping around that HOA neighborhood exactly like a massive ring with a jewel in the center. The community wasn't just on my land, it was surrounded by it, enclosed by it, dependent on it for access to roads, utilities, and even the trails they proudly advertised as exclusive to their residents. Still, even with all that power on paper, I wasn't planning on causing trouble. I figured I'd review the situation, maybe renew their lease, and move on with my life. I wasn't looking for drama. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking to become the villain of some suburban reality show. But fate and the HOA had other ideas. Because the moment I drove out there for the first time to inspect the property, I saw exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. The neighborhood entrance was decorated with towering stone pillars engraved with the HOA name, as if they wanted to intimidate anyone who dared enter. Bold signs warned that non-residents would be fined, towed, or prosecuted to the full extent. Landscaping was immaculate, gates freshly painted, and the community center sat like a self-declared palace. The whole place radiated the kind of energy that said, "We're in charge here." But I knew something they didn't. They weren't in charge of anything at all. Not legally, not structurally, and certainly not financially. They were standing proudly on land they didn't own, enforcing rules they had no right to enforce. The first HOA member I encountered was a woman patrolling the area with the rigid intensity of a security guard, but armed with a notepad instead of a badge. She looked at my old truck with instant disapproval, scribbling something down with the kind of exaggerated importance only seasoned complainers possess. It didn't matter that I technically owned the road she was standing on. In her world, I was the outsider, the intruder, someone she believed she could scold into compliance. I didn't engage. I didn't need to. Everything around her, from the shoes she was standing on to the street sign she felt responsible for, was already mine. The power dynamic wasn't just unbalanced, it was upside down, though she had no idea yet. The documents I'd brought detailed something even more incredible. The HOA's lease was expiring in months. And because of some neglected renewal procedures and their arrogance in assuming no one would ever question it, the contract gave me total discretion over whether they kept their land use rights at all. If I didn't renew it, they'd lose access to their amenities, their trails, and even their own roads. For now, I simply observed. I walked the outer fields, surveyed the ponds, studied the property lines. And everywhere I looked, I saw signs posted by the HOA claiming jurisdiction they didn't have. Trespassing notices, curfew rules, fishing restrictions, even a bold declaration that unauthorized photography of the community was prohibited, all on my land. As the day went on, I noticed more board members and self-important residents giving me suspicious glances. They didn't know me, but they instinctively categorized me as someone who didn't belong, someone who wasn't following their rules. I could practically feel the hostility brewing beneath their polite smiles. But what they didn't know was this: I wasn't just a visitor. I wasn't a rebel breaking their imaginary laws. I was the landowner, the person with the final say over everything they believed they controlled. And the more I saw, the more clear it became that this HOA was not a humble cooperative group. They were tyrants in khakis and golf carts, drunk on authority they didn't actually possess. By the time I returned to my truck, I knew one thing for certain. This inheritance wasn't going to be a quiet transfer of paperwork. The HOA, the board members, the nosy neighbors, none of them were going to make this simple. They were the kind of people who pushed first and apologized never. Sooner or later, they would confront me, challenge me, try to control me. And when they did, they would discover something they never saw coming, something no one in that community had prepared for. Because I wasn't just the new landowner. I held every card they didn't know existed. And the moment they crossed the line, which they would inevitably, this quiet inheritance was going to become the HOA nightmare of the century.
Things escalated faster than I expected. I assumed I'd have at least a few days before the HOA noticed a stranger walking their streets, inspecting their precious landscaping, taking notes on a clipboard of my own. But the next morning, before I'd even unpacked half the paperwork from the inheritance, I received a letter. Not from the law office, not from the county, from them, the HOA itself. The envelope was aggressively branded with their logo, as if it were some kind of royal crest. The return address came from their compliance department, a name that already hinted at how seriously they took their pretend authority. Inside was a printed notice accusing me of multiple violations, including unauthorized presence, lack of vehicle registration with the HOA, and a list of petty infractions that only the most power-hungry board members could possibly invent. The letter even threatened escalating fines, enforcement actions, and potential towing of my truck if I entered their property again without permission. I stared at the notice for a long moment, marveling at the sheer audacity. These people truly believed the community belonged to them. They believed the roads were theirs, the trails were theirs, the spaces were theirs. They were so wrapped up in their own imagined dominion that it never occurred to them someone else, someone ordinary, someone not molded in their image, might own everything beneath their feet. But the best part wasn't the letter itself. It was the timestamp. According to the notice, one of their board members had reported me within hours of my visit. The same woman with the notepad must have seen me again on her security cameras and wasted no time escalating things. I wasn't just a stranger to them. I was an intruder in their kingdom, someone they believed they could intimidate into silence. They didn't know they were trying to intimidate their landlord. The more I thought about it, the more I realized their behavior wasn't merely arrogance. It was entitlement layered on top of ignorance. They had spent years ruling over homeowners with a rigid iron grip. They issued citations for grass length, mailbox color, trash can placement, seasonal decor, driveway cracks, and any tiny breach in their painstakingly curated image. Their confidence came from never being challenged. They expected everyone to fold, everyone to obey, everyone to pay their fines without complaint. And now they thought I was just another problem to swat down. Their first mistake had been sending the letter. Their second mistake came later that same afternoon. As I drove back out to the property to continue surveying the land, I encountered a roadblock, literally. A small folding barricade stood across the entrance to the community, with a hand-painted sign taped to it. The message was unmistakably theirs, a notice informing unauthorized individuals that access was restricted due to ongoing HOA security concerns. Behind the barricade sat two golf carts parked like patrol vehicles, manned by residents who had clearly appointed themselves gatekeepers for the day. They didn't know that barricading the entrance to the neighborhood meant they were blocking a public easement built on private land they didn't own. They didn't know they were violating the very lease their community depended on. They didn't know they were challenging someone who held all the leverage, not just some of it. As I parked near the entrance and stepped out to take photos for my records, the volunteers glared at me with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from people who've never been told no. Their posture made it clear they believed they were defending their turf from a dangerous outsider, someone who threatened their order and cleanliness. Their golf carts were positioned like they could stop me if I attempted to bypass the barricade. I didn't argue, I didn't confront. I simply documented everything. The barricade, the signs, the self-appointed guards. Every detail would matter later. Every impulsive move they made would become part of the bigger picture they didn't know I was assembling. The irony of the scene almost made me laugh. Here they were, trying to enforce imaginary property rights against the actual property owner. After leaving the barricaded entrance, I drove around the outer edges of the 1,000 acres, familiarizing myself with the boundaries. The land was wild, peaceful, and untouched in many areas. Tall pines lined ridges overlooking winding streams. Old fence posts, weathered and tilting, marked sections that hadn't needed maintenance in years. Hidden dirt paths cut through thickets, leading to quiet clearings that likely once had been used by my relative but forgotten over time. The more I explored, the more deeply I felt a sense of responsibility, not the kind you feel when you simply own something, but the kind that came from inheriting a legacy. This land had been kept intact for decades, waiting patiently for someone to understand its history and its value. And right in the middle of it sat an HOA that disrespected it more than they realized, using it as a platform for their strict, self-serving agenda. By the time I completed my circuit around the property, another thought struck me. The HOA's lease wasn't just expiring soon, it had been neglected so thoroughly that by its original terms, their right to use the land could be voided immediately if the landowner could prove certain breaches. And based on what I'd already witnessed, unauthorized restrictions, barricades, improper use, violations of access agreements, they had breached it 100 different ways. They had no idea how precarious their situation had become. Over the next few days, their escalation continued. More notices arrived, more threats of fines, more accusations of trespassing. They were convinced they were building a case against me, when in reality, they were documenting their own downfall. The peak of their arrogance came on a Thursday evening, when I drove back toward the community to check the boundary markers again. This time a group of board members stood outside the HOA office building, on land they assumed was theirs, passing around clipboards, gesturing toward a printed photo of me they'd clearly pulled from one of their security cameras. They scrutinized it like detectives studying a suspect. In their minds, I wasn't a landowner. I was a problem, a nuisance, a threat to the picture-perfect world they believed they controlled. But I said nothing. I made no moves to reveal my identity or my authority. I let them build their case, I let them dig their hole. Because some stories don't begin with confrontation. They begin with quiet observation, strategic patience, and letting the aggressors expose themselves fully. And this HOA was exposing itself faster than I ever imagined. What they didn't understand, what they wouldn't understand until it was far too late, was that their war had already started. But it wasn't a war they were going to win.
By the time the third week rolled around, the HOA had succeeded in irritating practically everyone except themselves. They'd escalated their patrols, doubled the number of volunteers monitoring the entrances, and even stationed one board member in a lawn chair near the main road, like some kind of self-appointed sentinel. Every time I approached, cameras turned, clipboards appeared. Pens clicked with a sense of triumph, as if they were gathering evidence for a case destined to fall apart the moment a real authority looked at it. They still had no idea who I was. And I'll admit, there was something strangely entertaining about watching them get more and more desperate to control a situation they had already lost. But entertainment wasn't my goal. The reality was simple. Their lease was expiring. Their conduct was out of line, and if they kept pushing, the consequences wouldn't be something they could find their way out of. What they did next pushed everything over the edge. They sent a notice to the county sheriff accusing me of stalking residents, trespassing, and causing community panic. They included screenshots of me walking on my own land, notes claiming I had malicious intent, and statements from residents who had clearly been whipped into a frenzy by the HOA's fear-mongering. But the sheriff's office, unlike the HOA, actually checked property records. They learned I wasn't a threat, I wasn't a trespasser, I wasn't a random nuisance. I was the legal owner of every acre in that area, including the HOA's precious neighborhood, and the county confirmed it in writing. The sheriff's office didn't pursue anything. They didn't show up at my door. They simply forwarded the HOA's complaint to me as a courtesy, along with a short summary indicating they had informed the HOA that they had no jurisdiction over me on my own land. And that, apparently, was the moment the HOA realized something had gone catastrophically wrong. The energy shifted immediately. Within 24 hours, the patrol volunteers vanished, the barricade disappeared, the residents guarding the entrances retreated back into their homes as if the HOA board had quietly instructed everyone to pretend nothing had happened. But the board itself wasn't ready to let go. They shifted strategies, and this time they tried to weaponize paperwork. One morning, I found a certified envelope taped to the door of the small cabin I had temporarily rented near the property line. Inside was a legal-looking packet prepared by the HOA's attorney. It accused me of violating their community standards, demanded that I register as a non-resident contractor if I wished to step foot in the neighborhood, and insisted I was interfering with HOA operations. I read through the packet carefully. Then I reread it. And by the time I finished, I understood their new tactic. They weren't trying to intimidate me physically anymore. They were trying to drown me in fabricated bureaucracy, hoping that if they threw enough forms, threats, and official-sounding language at me, I'd back down or disappear. They still didn't know the truth, though they were beginning to suspect it. I decided the time for subtlety had passed. They wanted a paper war? Fine. It was time they received a notice of my own. But my notice wouldn't come from emotion. It wouldn't come from retaliation. It would come from contract law, property records, and the full weight of the lease they had allowed to rot. I drafted a formal letter, copied directly from the legal clauses my relative's attorney had explained in the original inheritance packet. The letter stated the HOA's lease was under administrative review. All land use rights were being evaluated. The HOA was to cease unauthorized roadblocks or access restrictions, and all future communication would go through the landowner's legal representative. And for the first time, I signed it not with my personal name, but with my new legal title, majority landowner and inheritor of the Thompson estate. Within 24 hours of dropping that letter into the HOA's office mail slot, everything inside the neighborhood erupted. Residents who had barely noticed me before suddenly took a keen interest in the property boundaries. They paced the sidewalks nervously. They whispered in driveways. They stood in their yards staring at the HOA office as if someone would come out and explain how their entire community was tied to land none of them controlled. The board members didn't handle the pressure well. I watched them from a distance as they swarmed around their office building. They made frantic phone calls. They held emergency meetings and passed papers back and forth so quickly it looked like they were trying to fan a fire that was already engulfing them. It was clear they had finally looked into the land records themselves. They had finally learned that nothing beneath their neighborhood belonged to the HOA. They had finally realized that all their heavy-handed rules, fines, threats, and control tactics had been built on an illusion, a false belief that ownership equaled power, when they never had ownership to begin with. But instead of apologizing or attempting a civil conversation, the board made one last desperate attempt to regain control. They issued a community-wide memo urging residents not to interact with me, not to acknowledge me, and not to aid the landowner in any attempt to disrupt HOA business. They attempted to frame me as an outsider trying to dismantle the community. They urged unity. They encouraged vigilance. They tried to portray themselves as heroes defending their neighborhood from an invader. But fear only worked for so long. A few residents eventually crossed paths with me in the outer fields, and their hesitation was obvious. They lingered as if they wanted answers, but were afraid of HOA retaliation. Their confusion, the uncertainty in their posture told me the board had overplayed their hand. They'd spent years cultivating control through intimidation. But intimidation doesn't work when the foundation of authority dissolves. The truth was out there now, floating through backyards, through online forums, through private messages between neighbors. And the truth had weight. I was the landowner. I had every legal right to be there. Their HOA's power relied entirely on my permission. And for the first time in the community's history, their permission wasn't guaranteed. Everything was about to change. The board knew it. The residents sensed it. And the land itself, quiet, patient, older than any rule book, seemed to echo the shift. The storm they had tried to unleash on me was now circling back on them, gathering strength. And the next phase of this battle would reshape their entire existence.
The week after I revealed myself as the landowner felt like the slow unwind of a tightly coiled spring. For months, maybe years, the HOA board had stretched their authority far beyond reason, confident that homeowners were too intimidated to push back. But now, that spring was snapping back in their faces, and the sound of it echoed through every cul-de-sac and manicured lawn in the neighborhood. At first, the board tried to maintain the illusion of control. Their office remained lit late into the night as members filed paperwork, shuffled documents, and printed out memos intended to assert dominance they no longer possessed. They walked around with stacks of clipboards, stacks of reports, stacks of everything except actual authority. Anyone watching from the outside could see their energy changing. Panic beneath the polished smiles, frantic activity beneath their outward calm. But something else changed, too. The residents.
Whispers became questions, questions became murmurs, murmurs became uneasy suspicion, and suspicion eventually turned into something the HOA feared more than anything else: independent thinking. For the first time in the community's history, residents began reading their own bylaws instead of relying on the board's interpretations. They began checking property maps, finding old land records, and discovering that the HOA's power was built on carefully maintained confusion. Every document they uncovered chipped away at the board's credibility. Every old map they found confirmed what I had already known. The HOA didn't own the land, not 1 inch of it. The board could feel their grip loosening. Their once rigid structure was cracking at the seams. Desperation breeds mistakes, and the HOA was making them rapidly. Their first major blunder happened on a bright Monday morning. Without consulting the community, they attempted to host a mandatory emergency inspection day. They sent uniformed volunteers door to door, clipboards in hand, determined to re-establish dominance through sheer presence. But instead of compliance, they were met with uncertainty. Homeowners stared at them not with fear this time, but with calculation, wondering whether the people knocking on their doors had any real authority left at all. Some residents refused inspections outright. Others asked for proof of jurisdiction the volunteers couldn't provide. The HOA hadn't expected resistance, and their volunteers weren't prepared for it. They shuffled from house to house, increasingly uncomfortable as the tone of the neighborhood shifted from obedient to skeptical. By noon, the inspection initiative had fallen apart. Their second major mistake came shortly after. In an attempt to regain control, the HOA distributed a new set of community rules, rules that were stricter, harsher, and more invasive than any they had issued before. They clearly believed that tightening their grip would stop the leaks in their authority. But all it did was push residents further away. People who had accepted HOA control as an unavoidable part of suburban life now felt cornered. They watched the board's frantic behavior, felt the tension rising, and began to realize that the entity claiming to protect their community was actually its biggest disruptor. But the final blow came from an unexpected place: the county. After receiving multiple complaints from both residents and the HOA itself, the county performed a standard review of zoning, access rights, and land use compliance. What they found didn't favor the HOA. Not only had the board violated multiple clauses in the decades-old lease, but they had enforced rules on property they didn't own, restricted access in ways they were not legally permitted to do, and even altered shared use paths without seeking approval from the rightful landowner: me. The county drafted a report outlining these issues and shared it with both parties. The HOA's carefully crafted illusion of control began collapsing under the weight of official documentation they couldn't argue with. Their authority wasn't merely weakened, it was now questionable in the eyes of the very homeowners they depended on for legitimacy. And once the foundation cracks, the structure inevitably shifts. Residents held their own gatherings, quiet, informal meetings in living rooms and backyards. They talked about the possibility of dissolving the HOA entirely. They discussed alternatives, community committees, voluntary maintenance groups, and even transitioning to a model where I granted land use rights directly to homeowners instead of the board. Rumors swirled that several board members were being pressured to resign. A few homeowners even started drafting petitions, testing the waters for an official vote to remove certain officials from the board. The HOA knew this. They felt it. And the fear that radiated from the board was so potent it was practically tangible. But instead of humility, they chose escalation. Their next move changed everything. They attempted to host an all-community meeting, one designed to rally residents against me, the outsider threatening their lifestyle. They printed flyers and stuffed them into every mailbox. They positioned the meeting as a last stand, a moment of unity, a show of strength. But what they didn't realize was that the narrative had already slipped from their hands. Residents attended, but not with the docile obedience the board expected. They came looking for answers, and the board didn't have any. The meeting, by all accounts, devolved into chaos. Board members tried to spin stories, cite non-existent laws, and cling to authority that evaporated under scrutiny. The more they tried to assert control, the more flustered they became. Homeowners began questioning everything. Why hadn't the board told them about the lease years ago? Why had they acted as though they owned the land? Why had they provoked the person who actually held the legal rights to everything around them? Why had they lied about their authority for so long? The meeting didn't restore the HOA's power. It shattered it. By the time the board adjourned, residents were no longer looking at them as protectors. They were looking at them as the architects of a problem that threatened the stability of their entire community. And while the HOA spiraled, I remained steady. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't out to destroy their lives, but I wasn't going to let a self-appointed board bully me or mislead their community any longer. The lease review was ongoing. The county was involved. Attorneys were involved. And soon, decisions would have to be made, decisions that would determine whether the HOA continued to exist at all. As the sun set on the fourth chapter of this unfolding drama, one truth had become undeniable. The HOA had gone to war believing they were undefeatable. But wars are won by those who understand the battlefield. And this battlefield, the land, the roads, the easements, the very earth beneath the neighborhood, belonged to me.
The final chapter of this saga didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation. It didn't begin with yelling, threats, or showdowns in cul-de-sacs. It began quietly, almost anticlimactically, with the kind of calm that only appears when a storm has drained all its fury. The HOA board had pushed their authority to its breaking point, and now they stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage of their own decisions. In the days following the chaotic community meeting, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't the pristine, overly curated environment the board had worked so hard to maintain. It wasn't filled with bright smiles and rigid perfection. Instead, there was stillness, a tension that hovered over the sidewalks like morning fog. People moved slower. They watched. They thought. They whispered behind closed doors about what would happen next. The board members, once strutting through the neighborhood with clipboards and confidence, now avoided public spaces. Their meetings were no longer bustling displays of dominance. They were hushed sessions held behind blinds tightly drawn shut. Their cars were parked at odd hours. Their behavior had shifted from controlling to nervously calculating. They knew their time was almost up. I wasn't interested in revenge. That was never the goal. My intention was to resolve the land issue, establish proper boundaries, and make sure no one, HOA or otherwise, could manipulate residents through fear or misinformation again. I wanted closure. They wanted survival. Only one of us was going to get what we wanted. The county's review concluded on a warm Friday afternoon, and the results arrived in a sealed envelope delivered to both me and the HOA simultaneously. It contained every violation the board had committed, every unauthorized action, every breach of the lease, every misuse of land they didn't own. But more importantly, it included one crucial statement. Based on the findings, land use rights could not be renewed under the HOA's current governing structure. The county recommended that the existing HOA be dissolved. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. The board's authority wasn't merely weakened, now it was legally invalid. When the news reached the residents, shock rippled through the community. Some people were relieved, having long felt suffocated by the endless rules. Others were anxious, having relied on the HOA to make decisions they'd never had to make themselves. But nearly everyone agreed on one point. The board had brought this upon themselves. And then came the moment that sealed their fate.
the moment I had prepared for since the day I inherited the land. I delivered my final letter. It wasn't wrong, it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't written with the coldness of retaliation or the flourish of triumph. It was simple, factual, and precise. It stated that the HOA's lease was officially terminated. It stated that the board no longer held any land use rights or operational authority. It stated that a transition would occur immediately. But the final section was what no one expected. I offered the residents something the HOA never had: autonomy. Instead of keeping all the land under a single lease agreement, I divided the community's occupied section of the 1,000 acres into individual parcels. Homeowners would receive long-term, low-cost land use contracts directly from me, contracts that granted them freedom from HOA control. They would manage their own properties. They would form committees only if they wanted to. They would be able to decorate their porches, paint their mailboxes, choose their landscaping, and live without the constant fear of violations or fines. They would be neighbors, not subordinates. But as for the board members, there was nothing for them to transition into. Their power evaporated overnight. The reactions came quickly. Some homeowners celebrated openly. They removed the old HOA signs, repainted fences, and threw out boxes of violation notices that had accumulated over the years. The air felt lighter. Children played in yards that had once been monitored for acceptable toy placement. The community began to rediscover itself. Others approached the change more cautiously. Without the HOA dictating every detail, they feared the unknown. But even their caution began softening into something else: curiosity, independence, possibility. The board members, meanwhile, withdrew completely. For years, they had thrived on authority, schedules, bylaws, and enforcement. Without those tools, they were simply residents again. Residents who had to face their neighbors without the shield of power. By the end of the week, the board resigned in full. Their office was cleared out, leaving behind empty bulletin boards, abandoned stacks of rule books, and faded posters boasting about community standards. All the items that once represented their control now sat quietly in a storage room, collecting dust as symbols of an era that had ended. With the HOA dissolved, the community began something it had never been allowed before: healing. Neighbors who had been fined into resentment now talked freely. The tension between properties eased. People planted gardens they had always wanted but never received approval for. Others restored old decorative items they'd been forced to remove. Even the simple act of choosing a front door wreath became a small symbol of reclaimed freedom. As for me, I spent more time walking the outer acres, now at peace, untouched by the board's interference. The land felt calmer, almost grateful to return to its original quiet. I reflected on how strange fate could be. A letter I expected to ignore turned into responsibility, conflict, and change that affected dozens of families I'd never met before. But the land was safe, the people were free, and the chaos had finally settled. Several months later, I attended a community gathering, not mandated by any rule book, but organized voluntarily by residents who wanted to celebrate their new beginning. Tables of food were set up, children played freely, people talked, laughed, and shared stories about the past and hopes for the future. There was no board, no enforcement, no tension, just a neighborhood finally allowed to be what it should have been all along. As I walked the area, someone had erected a small wooden sign near the entrance. Not a warning sign, not a threat, not a set of rules, just a simple statement: "Welcome to our community, where we live by respect, not fear." A fitting ending for a place that had spent so long under the shadow of unnecessary control. The 1,000 acres were still mine. The responsibility was still mine. But now, instead of conflict, the land held something far more valuable: peace. The HOA had built its power on borrowed land, and when the truth surfaced, everything collapsed. But from the ruins, a new community emerged, one stronger, kinder, and freer than the oppressive system that had once ruled it.